The voice that drifted through the evening air was so achingly beautiful that Mason Zimmerman thought for a moment he might have died and gone straight to heaven without realizing it. He had been riding hard for 3 days across the New Mexico territory, pushing his luck and his horses to get back to his ranch outside El Dorado Canyon before the autumn storms rolled in. And now, in the fading gold light of September 1878, he heard something that stopped him cold in his saddle. Someone was singing to his horses. Mason had left 4 of his best mares in the care of old Pete Henderson while he traveled to Santa Fe on business. But Pete was tone deaf, and certainly would never sound like an angel. The voice was female, soft and rich like honey poured over warm bread, and it was coming from his own stable. His hand instinctively moved to the gun at his hip, but something about the gentle melody made him pause. This was no threat. This was something else entirely. He dismounted slowly, his boots making barely a whisper in the dust as he approached the weathered stable door. Through the gap in the wood, he could see her. She stood between 2 of his horses, one hand on each of their necks, swaying slightly as she sang an old hymn he recognized from his childhood. Her dress was simple, worn calico in a faded blue that had seen better days, and her dark auburn hair hung in a thick braid down her back. She could not have been more than 22 or 23 years old, close to his own 26 years. And there was something about the way she moved, the way she touched the animals, that spoke of a soul that understood loneliness. The horses were completely calm under her attention, ears forward, eyes half closed in contentment. Mason had never seen his sometimes skittish mares so relaxed with a stranger. The buckskin mare, usually nervous around anyone but him, was actually leaning into the woman's touch. He stood there for a long moment, just listening. The song shifted to something else, something he did not recognize, possibly something she had made up herself. The melody wove through the stable like a living thing, and Mason found his own breathing slowing to match the rhythm of it. When she finished, there was a moment of perfect silence broken only by the contented snuffling of the horses. Mason cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her but needing to make his presence known. She spun around, her green eyes wide with alarm. Her hand flew to her chest and she took a step back, bumping into the buckskin who nickered gently. "I am sorry," Mason said quickly, holding up both hands to show he meant no harm. "I did not mean to frighten you. This is my stable. These are my horses." The color drained from her face. "Oh God, I am so sorry, I thought. Pete said you would not be back until next week and the horses seemed so lonely and I thought." She was backing toward the other door, clearly preparing to run. "Wait," Mason said, surprised by how much he did not want her to leave. "Please, I am not angry." "That was beautiful. Your singing, I mean. The horses, they loved it, I could tell." She stopped but did not move any closer. In the dimming light, he could see she was even prettier than he had first thought, with a face that was all delicate bones and expressive features. There was a wariness in her eyes, though, a guardedness that spoke of hard times and harder lessons learned. "Who are you?" he asked gently. "Grace Dawson," she said quietly. "I have been helping Pete with some of the work around here. He hired me about a week ago. I needed the work and he needed the help, and I should have asked before I came in here with your horses, but they looked so sad standing there, and I have always found that singing helps with sadness." Mason felt something shift in his chest. "Grace," he repeated, liking the way her name felt in his mouth. "I am Mason Zimmerman. This is my ranch, what there is of it anyway, and you do not need to apologize. Those horses have not looked that peaceful in months. You have a gift." She relaxed slightly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction. "They are beautiful animals, well cared for. They just miss you, I think. Would you sing to me too?" The words were out before Mason could stop them, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. It was a forward thing to ask, possibly inappropriate, but there was something about her voice that had touched a place in him that had been cold and empty for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. Grace stared at him for a long moment, those green eyes searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because after a pause that felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "What would you like to hear?" she asked. "Anything," Mason said honestly. "Just anything at all." She took a breath and began to sing again, this time a different song, something slow and sweet about rivers and home and longing. Mason leaned against the stable door and closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He had not realized how tired he was, how bone-deep weary, until this moment. 3 years of trying to make this ranch work. 3 years since his father died and left him with more debt than cattle. 3 years of wondering if he was fighting a losing battle against the harsh New Mexico land and his own inexperience. But standing here in the growing darkness with this stranger's voice filling the air around him, Mason felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt hope. When the song ended, he opened his eyes to find her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "Thank you," he said softly. "That was exactly what I needed." Grace smiled then, a small hesitant thing, but it transformed her face. "You are welcome, Mr. Zimmerman." "Mason," he corrected. "Please, just Mason." "Mason," she repeated, and he liked the sound of his name in her voice almost as much as he liked her singing. The moment was broken by Pete Henderson's gravelly voice calling from the direction of the main house. "That you, Mason? Thought I heard your horse." "It is me, Pete," Mason called back. "I am in the stable." The old man appeared a moment later, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "You made good time. Thought you would be another few days at least." His eyes moved to Grace. "I see you met my helper." "I did," Mason said. "She was singing to the horses." Pete chuckled. "She does that. Damned if it does not work too. That mean buckskin of yours has been sweet as pie since Grace started coming around. Even let me check her hooves yesterday without any fuss." Mason looked at Grace with new appreciation. "How long can you stay?" Grace hesitated. "I was planning to move on soon. I have been working for room and board in Pete's extra cabin, but I do not want to overstay my welcome." "Stay," Mason said, again surprising himself with his directness. "I mean, if you want to. If Pete says you have been helpful, then I would be grateful for the extra pair of hands. God knows there is more work than the two of us can handle. I could pay you proper wages, not just room and board." He saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or relief, or something else entirely. "I do not need charity," she said quietly, but there was no anger in her voice, just a simple statement of fact. "It is not charity," Mason replied honestly. "This ranch is barely holding on. I lost 2 good ranch hands last month who went looking for easier money in the silver mines up north. If you can help with the horses, that alone would be worth wages, and if you can do other things too." He let the question hang in the air. "I can cook," Grace said, "and clean. I can mend fences and tack. I grew up on a farm in Missouri before." She stopped abruptly, and Mason saw pain flash across her face. "Before," he prompted gently. "Before it does not matter anymore," she said firmly. "That life is gone. This is my life now." Mason understood that kind of loss, the kind that cut so deep you could not speak of it. He nodded. "All right then, if you want the work, it is yours." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then at Pete, then back at Mason. "All right," she said finally, "I will stay. For now." Those last 2 words hung in the air like a challenge or maybe a promise. Mason was not sure which. But as he watched her turn back to stroke the buckskin mare one more time before heading out into the evening, He knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed in some fundamental way. He just had no idea how much. The next morning came bright and clear, the kind of September day that made you forget New Mexico could be unforgiving. Mason woke in his own bed for the first time in weeks and lay there for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch waking up around him. Chickens clucking, horses nickering, the creak of the windmill Pete had finally gotten working properly last spring. And singing. He sat up, straining to hear. Yes, that was definitely Grace's voice coming from somewhere outside. He dressed quickly and made his way out to the yard, following the sound. She was at the well, hauling up water and singing as she worked. The melody was something cheerful this time, completely different from the haunting songs of the night before. Her braids swung with her movements and her face, no longer guarded, looked younger and lighter in the morning sun. "Morning," Mason called, not wanting to startle her again. She turned and smiled, and he felt that same shift in his chest as yesterday. "Good morning. I made coffee." "It is in the house. Pete showed me where everything was. You did not have to do that, I know," she said simply, "but I wanted to earn my keep." They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say. Finally, Mason cleared his throat. "I was thinking I would ride out to check the north pasture today. Some of the cattle have been ranging too far, and I need to move them back before they wander onto Miller's land and cause trouble. Would you want to come? I could use the help, and it would give you a chance to see more of the property." Grace considered this. "I am not much of a rider. Can you sit a horse?" "Well enough, I suppose." "Then you ride well enough for ranch work," Mason said with a grin. "Come on. I will saddle up 2 of the gentler horses. We will make a day of it." An hour later they were riding out across the scrubland, Mason on his big bay gelding and Grace on a sweet-tempered gray mare named Silver. She sat the horse awkwardly at first, but Mason could see she had not lied about her basic ability. She knew how to handle the reins and how to move with the animal rather than against it. "So you grew up on a farm?" he asked as they rode. Grace was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "In Missouri, yes. My father raised corn mostly, some pigs, a few chickens. It was not much, but it was home." "What brought you all the way out here?" Another long pause. "After my parents died, the farm went to my uncle. He had plans for me that I did not agree with, so I left. Started moving west, taking work where I could find it. Ended up in Santa Fe 6 months ago, then heard there might be work out this way." Mason heard all the things she was not saying, the pain behind the simple words, the loneliness, the fear. He wanted to ask more, but sensed she had already shared more than she was comfortable with. "Well, I am glad you ended up here," he said instead. She glanced at him, something unreadable in her green eyes. "Are you?" "Yes," he said honestly. "This place gets lonely. Pete is good company, but he is not much for conversation. And the silence can get heavy sometimes." "I know something about heavy silence," Grace said softly. They rode in companionable quiet after that, the only sounds the steady clop of hooves and the occasional call of a crow. When they reached the north pasture, Mason was pleased to see most of the cattle were where they should be, grazing peacefully in the autumn grass. Only a few had strayed toward the property line. "Stay here," he told Grace. "I am just going to push those strays back toward the center." But as he rode toward the wayward cattle, his bay suddenly shied hard to the left, spooked by a rattlesnake coiled in the grass. Mason, tired from days of travel and not expecting the movement, lost his seat and hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of him and sent a sharp pain shooting through his left arm. "Mason!" Grace's cry seemed to come from very far away. He heard hoofbeats, and then she was there, kneeling beside him, her face white with concern. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" He tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through his arm. I think, I think I might have broken something. Grace's hands were gentle but efficient as she carefully felt along his arm. It is your wrist, she said. Definitely broken. We need to get you back to the house. The cattle, he protested weakly. Can wait, she said firmly. Pete can handle them later. You need to see a doctor. Getting Mason back on his horse with a broken wrist was an exercise in pain and stubbornness, but between his determination and Grace's surprising strength, they managed it. She rode close beside him the whole way back, ready to steady him if he swayed. Pete took one look at Mason's swelling wrist and went to fetch the doctor from El Dorado Canyon, a 2-hour ride each way. That left Grace to help Mason into the house and get him settled. I am sorry, he said as she brought him water and helped him prop his arm on a pillow. Some first impression I am making. You mean singing to me yesterday? Grace asked with the hint of a smile. Oh, wait, that was me. Despite the pain, Mason laughed. I meant falling off my horse like a greenhorn. Anyone could have been thrown by a snake spook, Grace said practically. Even the best riders. You just had bad luck. She moved around the room with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, finding clean cloths to wrap his wrist until the doctor could set it properly. Mason watched her work and felt that strange tightness in his chest again. You are good at this, he observed. Taking care of people. I took care of my mother before she died, Grace said. She was sick for a long time. You learn to be efficient. I am sorry, Mason said. About your mother and your father. Grace's hand stilled for a moment. Thank you, it was 2 years ago now. The grief is not so sharp anymore, but the missing. That never really goes away, does it? No, Mason agreed, thinking of his own father. It does not. She brought him soup for lunch, something Pete had made yesterday that she warmed over the fire. As he ate awkwardly with his good hand, she sat in the chair across from him, and for the first time since they met, she looked directly at him without that guardedness in her eyes. Why did you ask me to sing to you? She asked quietly. Mason set down his spoon, considering his answer carefully. Because you looked like you understood sadness, he said finally. And I have been sad for a long time. I thought maybe if someone who understood sang about it, it might hurt a little less. Did it? She asked. Hurt less? Yes, he said honestly. It did. Grace smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. Good. I am glad. The doctor arrived as the sun was beginning to set, a tired-looking man named Edwards who had been tending to the people of El Dorado Canyon and the surrounding ranches for the better part of 20 years. He examined Mason's wrist with practiced hands, pronounced it definitely broken, and set about splinting it properly. You will need to keep this immobilized for at least 6 weeks, he said as he worked. No ranch work, no heavy lifting, nothing that could jar it and cause it to set wrong. Mason groaned. I cannot afford 6 weeks off work. This ranch barely runs with me working full time. You have help, though, Dr. Edwards said, nodding toward Grace, who hovered nearby. Pete said you hired this young lady. Between the two of them, they should be able to keep things running. I cannot ask her to do my work, Mason protested. You are not asking, Grace said firmly. I am offering. That is what ranch hands do, is it not? The work that needs doing. She has a point, the doctor said with a chuckle. You would be wise to accept help when it is offered, Mason. Pride does not pay the bills or tend the cattle. So Mason accepted, though it grated against everything in him to be laid up while others did his work. For the next few days, he was forced to rest and watch as Grace and Pete took over the running of the ranch. He expected things to fall apart, expected to hear complaints and problems, but instead he watched Grace transform before his eyes. Gone was the wary, uncertain woman he had found singing to his horses. In her place was someone capable and strong, someone who could haul water and mend fences and work alongside Pete without complaint. She sang while she worked, her voice carrying across the yard, and Mason found himself sitting on the porch just to listen. On the fourth evening after his accident, she brought him dinner and sat down beside him on the porch steps. "Your ranch is in worse shape than you let on," she said without preamble. Mason felt defensive pride rear up. "I know it is not much, but I am working on it." "I am not criticizing," Grace said gently. "I am just stating a fact. The north fence needs complete replacement. Half your tack is worn through. The roof on the stable has at least 3 leaks, and you are running about half the cattle this land could support." "I know," Mason said tiredly. "My father left me with more debt than assets when he died. I have been paying that off before I could invest in improvements. I finally got clear of it last year, but then I had a bad winter that killed off some of the herd and set me back again." Grace was quiet for a moment, looking out over the darkening land. "Why do you keep doing it? Why not sell and do something easier?" "Because it is mine," Mason said simply. "Because my father broke his back trying to make something out of this land, and I owe it to him to finish what he started. And because I am stubborn, I suppose." "I understand stubborn," Grace said with a small smile. "My uncle wanted me to marry his business partner, a man 30 years older than me who had already buried 2 wives. When I refused, he said I was being stubborn and ungrateful. What did you do?" "I left in the middle of the night with everything I could carry in a carpet bag. I figured being stubborn and free was better than being cooperative and miserable." Mason looked at her with new respect. "That took courage, or foolishness," Grace said. "I am still not sure which." "Does it matter? You are here now, you are free." "Am I?" Grace asked softly. "Sometimes I wonder. I am always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for my uncle to find me and drag me back. That is not really freedom, is it?" Mason wanted to tell her she was safe here, that he would protect her, but he barely knew her and he had no right to make such promises. Instead he said, "My father used to say that freedom is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to act despite the fear." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was a dreamer," Mason said. "But yes, he was wise too. He believed this land could be something special. I wish he had lived to see it become what I know it can be." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. Finally Grace stood. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow Pete and I are going to start on the north fence." "Grace," Mason said, stopping her before she could go inside, "thank you for everything." She smiled at him, and in the lamplight from the house she looked almost ethereal. "You are welcome, Mason." The weeks passed in a strange sort of rhythm. Mason's wrist healed slowly while Grace and Pete kept the ranch running. Mason found himself looking forward to the evenings most of all, when the work was done and Grace would sit with him on the porch. Sometimes she sang. Sometimes they just talked, sharing bits and pieces of their lives like gifts. He learned that her favorite color was the deep purple of the sky just before full dark. That she had always wanted to see the ocean but never had. That she could not cook worth a damn, despite her claims to the contrary. But she was trying to learn from Pete, who was surprisingly good in the kitchen. She learned that Mason had once wanted to be a lawyer but gave it up to run the ranch. That he was afraid of letting his father down, even in death. That he had been engaged once 3 years ago to a girl from Santa Fe who decided ranch life was not for her and married a store owner instead. "You still love her?" Grace asked one evening. Mason thought about it honestly. "No. I do not think I ever really did, to be truthful. I think I loved the idea of not being alone more than I loved her." "I understand that," Grace said softly. "Loneliness can make us do foolish things." "Is that why you are here?" Mason asked. "Because you were lonely." Grace met his eyes. I am here because your horses looked sad and I know what that feels like. I stayed because you asked me to sing and no one had asked me for anything that's simple and honest in a very long time, and I keep staying because." She trailed off. "Because," Mason prompted, his heart beating faster. "Because I am not lonely here," she finished quietly. "And I have been lonely for so long I had forgotten what it felt like not to be." Mason reached out with his good hand and took hers. Her fingers were work roughened and warm. "I am not lonely anymore either," he said. They sat there holding hands as the night deepened around them, and Mason felt something settle into place in his chest, something that felt like coming home. 2 days later, trouble arrived in the form of a man on an expensive horse riding up to the ranch house. He was well dressed, probably in his 50s, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. Mason knew instinctively this was bad news even before Grace saw him and went pale as death. "That is him," she whispered. "That is my uncle's business partner, the man he wanted me to marry." The man dismounted and walked toward the porch with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. "Grace Dawson," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Your uncle has been very worried about you." "I am fine, Mr. Preston," Grace said, and Mason heard the tremor in her voice. "You can tell my uncle I am well and employed and have no intention of returning." "That is not how this is going to work," Preston said. "You are coming back with me. Your uncle is your legal guardian until you marry, and he has decided it is time you fulfilled your obligations." "I am 22 years old," Grace said, finding some of her courage. "I do not need a guardian." "The law says otherwise for an unmarried woman," Preston replied coldly. "Now get your things. We leave within the hour." "She is not going anywhere," Mason said, standing up despite the lingering ache in his healing wrist. "This is my property and Grace is my employee. She has made it clear she does not want to go with you." Preston turned his cold gaze on Mason. "This is none of your concern, boy. This is a family matter. It became my concern when you rode onto my land and threatened someone under my protection," Mason said, his voice hard. "Protection?" Preston laughed, an ugly sound. "You think you can protect her? I have lawyers and money and the law on my side. What do you have?" "A failing ranch and a broken arm." Mason felt his temper rising but forced himself to stay calm. "I have right on my side, and that counts for more than you think." "Does it?" Preston stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Let me tell you how this is going to go. Grace is coming with me. If you try to stop me, I will have the sheriff arrest you for kidnapping and interfering with a guardian's legal rights. Then, I will buy this sad little ranch out from under you for pennies on the dollar and burn it to the ground. Do we understand each other?" Before Mason could respond, Grace stepped between them. "I will go." "Grace, no," Mason protested. She looked at him and he saw tears in her green eyes. "I cannot let him destroy everything you have worked for. I will not." "There is another way," Mason said desperately, his mind racing. Then suddenly he knew what he had to do. He looked at Grace and saw his own wild hope reflected in her eyes. "Marry me." The words hung in the air like lightning about to strike. "What?" Grace breathed. "Marry me," Mason repeated, this time stronger, more certain. "Right now, today. If you are married, your uncle has no legal claim on you. Preston here loses his prize and you get to be free." Preston's face turned an ugly shade of red. "You cannot be serious. You have known her, what, a few weeks? This is obviously a sham marriage." "The law does not care about timing," Mason said, though he had no idea if that was true. "It only cares that the marriage is legal, and there is nothing saying two people cannot marry quickly if they choose to." He turned to Grace, taking her hands in his. "I know this is sudden. I know it is not romantic or probably even what you want. But I meant what I said about protection. I will not let him take you. If you are willing, we can ride into town right now and find a preacher. After that, you will be safe. And if you want to leave after, if you want the marriage annulled or dissolved, I will not fight you. But at least you will have a choice." Grace searched his face for a long moment. "Are you sure? This is a big thing to do for someone you barely know." "I am sure," Mason said, and realized he meant it. "Are you?" She took a shaky breath and then nodded. "Yes, yes, I am sure." Preston started to protest, but Mason cut him off. "Pete, saddle 3 horses. We are going to town." The ride to El Dorado Canyon was tense and silent. Preston followed them, clearly intending to interfere however he could, but Mason did not care. He and Grace rode side by side, and twice he caught her looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. The town was small, just a collection of buildings clustered around a main street, but it had a church and, more importantly, a preacher. Reverend Thomas was a kind-faced man who looked surprised when 3 dust-covered riders showed up at his door asking for a wedding ceremony immediately. "Is this young lady here of her own free will?" he asked, looking at Grace with concern. "She is," Grace said firmly. "I want this marriage." "And you, young man, you are certain?" "Absolutely certain," Mason said. The preacher looked at Preston. "And you are?" "A concerned family friend," Preston said smoothly. "I worry these young people are being hasty." "Many marriages are hasty," the Reverend said mildly. "That does not make them invalid. If these 2 want to marry, I see no reason to refuse them." The ceremony was short and simple. They had no rings, no flowers, no witnesses beyond Pete and a very angry Preston. But when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife and told Mason he could kiss his bride, Mason looked into Grace's eyes and saw something there that made his heart race. The kiss was gentle, barely a brush of lips, but Mason felt it all the way to his soul. When they pulled apart, Grace was blushing and Mason could not stop smiling. They signed the marriage certificate, making it legal and binding, and then turned to face Preston. "She is my wife now," Mason said quietly. "You have no claim on her." Preston's face was twisted with rage. "This is not over. I will contest this marriage. I will find a way to break it." "Try," Grace said, her voice stronger than Mason had ever heard it. "But I am done being afraid of you and my uncle. I am done letting other people control my life. I am married now, and that is the end of it." Preston stared at her for a long moment, then turned on his heel and stormed out of the church. In the silence that followed his departure, Mason turned to his new wife. "Are you all right?" Grace let out a long, shaky breath. "I think so, I think." She started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound. "I think I just got married to a man I have known for less than a month." "We both did," Mason pointed out, and then he was laughing too. Pete just shook his head. "You 2 are crazy, but I suppose it worked out." The ride back to the ranch was different from the ride into town. Mason and Grace rode close together, their legs occasionally brushing. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those deep purples Grace loved. And despite the strangeness of the situation, Mason felt a peace settle over him. When they reached the ranch, Pete tactfully announced he was going to sleep in the bunkhouse tonight and disappeared before either of them could respond. Mason and Grace stood in the yard, suddenly awkward with each other. "So," Grace said finally, "we are married." "We are," Mason agreed. "Grace, I meant what I said. If you want to leave, if you want to end this, I will not stop you. I just wanted you to be safe." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "What if I do not want to leave?" Mason's heart skipped. "Then you stay. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be." "And what about you?" Grace asked softly. "What do you want?" Mason took a step closer to her. The evening light turned her auburn hair to fire and made her green eyes glow. "I want you to stay. I want to get to know you better. I want to see if this thing between us, this connection, is real or just circumstance." "It is real," Grace said. "I have felt it since that first night when you asked me to sing to you." "So have I," Mason admitted. They stood there in the darkening yard, and then Grace rose up on her toes and kissed him. This kiss was different from the chaste brush of lips in the church. This was real and deep and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace smiled. "I suppose we should go inside. It is getting cold." Mason's house was small, just 3 rooms, and he suddenly realized he had not thought about the sleeping arrangements. "I can take the floor in the main room," he said quickly. "You should have the bed." Grace raised an eyebrow. "We are married, Mason. I know, but I do not want you to feel pressured or obligated." She took his hand. "I do not feel pressured, I feel. Actually, I am terrified and excited and confused all at once, but I know I do not want to sleep apart from you, not tonight." So they went inside together, and Mason built up the fire while Grace lit the lamps. They moved around each other carefully, learning the rhythm of sharing space. When it was time for bed, Mason offered her privacy to change, but she shook her head. "We are going to have to get used to each other eventually," she said practically. She was right, of course. So they changed, backs turned respectfully, and then climbed into the narrow bed together. It was awkward at first, trying to find a comfortable way to lie together, but eventually they settled with Grace's head on Mason's shoulder and his arm around her. "This is strange," Grace said into the darkness. "Which part?" Mason asked. "All of it. This morning I was a ranch hand. Tonight I am a wife. Regrets?" Grace was quiet for so long Mason thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she said, "No, no regrets. Scared, but no regrets." "You, same," Mason said honestly. "I did not expect to get married today, but I cannot say I am sorry it happened." Grace tilted her head to look up at him. Even in the darkness he could see the gleam of her eyes. "Ask me again." "Ask you what?" "To sing to you." So Mason asked, his voice soft. "Will you sing to me?" And Grace did, a quiet lullaby that wrapped around them both like a blessing. Mason listened and felt his eyes growing heavy. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the warmth of her body against his and the sound of her voice filling the darkness with light. The next few weeks were an education in learning to be married. Grace and Mason moved around each other carefully at first, both aware that their marriage had started as a practical solution to a problem rather than a love match. But slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. Mason found himself watching Grace as she worked, admiring the efficient way she moved, the strength in her small frame. He learned that she hummed when she was concentrating, that she had a temper when pushed, but was generally patient, that she was afraid of thunder but too proud to admit it. Grace discovered that Mason talked to the horses when he thought no one was listening, that he had a wicked sense of humor hidden under his serious exterior, that he blamed himself for every small thing that went wrong on the ranch even when it was not his fault. They worked together during the day, fixing fences and tending cattle. At night, they shared meals and conversation, and slowly the awkwardness faded. Mason found himself looking forward to evenings most of all, when they would sit together and Grace would sing, or they would just talk about anything and everything. One night about a month after their wedding, as they lay in bed in the darkness, Grace said, "I think I am falling in love with you." Mason's heart stuttered. "You think? All right, I know," Grace amended. "I know I am falling in love with you. Is that terrifying to hear?" "No," Mason said, rolling to face her, "because I am falling in love with you too." "Really?" Even in the darkness he could hear the smile in her voice. "Really," he confirmed. "I did not expect it. I thought we would be friends, maybe companions, but somewhere along the way it became more than that." Grace reached out and traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "When did you know?" Mason thought about it. "There was a morning about 2 weeks ago. I woke up before you and I just lay there watching you sleep. And I realized that I wanted to wake up like that every morning for the rest of my life. That is when I knew. For me, it was when you gave me that horrible burnt bread you tried to make and pretended it was good, Grace said with a laugh. You are a terrible liar, Mason Zimmerman, but you tried so hard to spare my feelings. That was when I knew. Mason pulled her close and kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. This was his wife, and he loved her, and she loved him back. What followed was natural and right. Two people who had found each other against all odds finally becoming truly husband and wife in every sense. Afterward, they lay tangled together, and Grace sang softly, a song of joy and belonging, and Mason knew he had finally found what his father had been searching for all those years. Not success with the ranch, though that would come, but home. A true home, built not on land or cattle or money, but on love. As autumn turned to winter, Mason and Grace settled into married life. The ranch work slowed with the cold weather, giving them more time together. They spent long evenings by the fire, planning improvements for the spring, dreaming about the future. Preston had made good on his threat to contest the marriage, but his lawyers found no grounds to break it. Grace was of legal age, had married of her own free will, and the ceremony had been properly conducted. The case was dismissed, and they heard that Preston had returned to Missouri in disgrace, his business dealings with Grace's uncle dissolved. Grace's uncle himself sent one letter, short and cold, disowning her completely. Grace read it with a sad smile and then threw it in the fire. That part of my life is over, she said firmly. I have a new family now. Winter was hard, as it always was in New Mexico, but they weathered it together. When the snows came, Mason and Grace would huddle close by the fire, and she would sing the old songs her mother had taught her. Pete, who had moved back into the house once the weather turned brutal, would sit and whittle and occasionally join in with his terrible voice, making them all laugh when spring finally arrived, bringing warmth and the promise of new growth. Mason sat down with Grace to discuss the future. I have been thinking, he said. With the money I have saved by not having to hire extra hands, thanks to you and Pete, I think I can afford to expand. Maybe add another 20 head of cattle, fix the stable roof properly instead of just patching it. That sounds good, Grace said. I have been thinking too, about the land on the east side, the section that is just sitting empty. What if we planted something there? Not a big farm, just a garden maybe, vegetables we could use and sell the extra. Mason considered this. That could work. You know about farming, and I know you miss it sometimes. Grace smiled. I do miss it, and I think our children should know how to grow things, not just raise them, our children. The words hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. You want children? Mason asked softly. Someday, Grace said. Not right away, we have too much work to do first. But someday, yes. Do you, with you? Yes, Mason said. Definitely yes. Spring turned to summer, and true to their plans, they expanded. The cattle herd grew. Grace's garden flourished, providing more vegetables than they could use and creating a new source of income when they sold the surplus in town. The ranch, slowly but surely, began to thrive. In June, a year after Mason had first heard Grace singing to his horses, they held a proper wedding celebration. They invited the whole town, such as it was, and Pete cooked enough food to feed an army. Reverend Thomas presided over a renewal of their vows, this time with rings that Mason had saved up to buy, simple silver bands that gleamed in the summer sun. As Grace promised to love and honor him, her voice clear and strong, Mason felt tears in his eyes. A year ago he had been alone and struggling, convinced he would spend his life fighting a losing battle with the land. Now he had a partner, a love, a future that looked brighter than anything he had dared to imagine. That night, after the guests had gone home and Pete had retired to the bunkhouse, Mason and Grace sat on their porch and watched the stars emerge. "Sing to me," Mason asked as he had that first night. Grace smiled and began to sing, her voice weaving through the warm summer air. But this time Mason joined in, his rougher voice blending with hers, creating something new and beautiful together. When the song ended, Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Mason Zimmerman. I love you too, Grace Zimmerman." The years that followed were not always easy. There were droughts and hard winters, sick cattle and broken equipment, days when it seemed like everything that could go wrong did. But they faced it all together, Mason and Grace, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something strong and lasting. 2 years after their wedding, Grace told Mason she was expecting their first child. He whooped with joy and spun her around until she laughingly demanded he put her down before she got sick. Their son was born in the spring of 1881, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Mason's father, and from his first breath he was loved beyond measure. Grace sang to him constantly, the same songs she had once sung to lonely horses, and Samuel would calm instantly at the sound of her voice. Mason would sit and watch them together, his wife and his son, and feel such overwhelming gratitude he could hardly breathe. The ranch continued to grow. With Grace's business sense and Mason's dedication, they slowly transformed the struggling property into something prosperous. They hired 3 more hands, all good men who Pete vetted personally. They expanded the herd again, added more land, built a new stable to replace the old one. When Samuel was 3, Grace gave birth to their daughter, a tiny thing they named Sarah. She had her father's determined chin and her mother's musical gift, singing before she could properly talk. Mason would sometimes think back to that September evening when he had first heard Grace's voice drifting through his stable. How impossible it seemed now that there had been a time when she was not part of his life. She was woven into every aspect of his existence. From the morning coffee she made just the way he liked it to the songs she sang while working in her garden, to the way she fit perfectly against him when they lay in bed at night. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Mason woke early and slipped out of bed without waking Grace. He made his way to the stable, now twice the size it had been when they married, and stood in the early morning light. The horses nickered at his approach, and he stroked their necks absently, his mind full of memories. 5 years. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime, sometimes like barely any time at all. "You are up early." He turned to find Grace standing in the stable doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. Their children were still asleep, giving them a rare moment alone. "I was just thinking," Mason said. "About what?" "About how I almost lost you before I ever really had you. If you had not been singing that day, if I had not asked you to stay, if Preston had come even a day earlier before we were married." Grace walked to him and took his hands. "But none of those things happened. I was singing. You did ask me to stay. Preston came too late. We are here, Mason. Together. Stop worrying about what might have been and focus on what is." She was right, as she usually was. Mason pulled her close and kissed her. "Sing to me," he asked, as he had so many times over the years. Grace smiled and began to sing, her voice filling the stable just as it had that first evening. But this time Mason truly listened to the words, a song about love found and kept, about home and belonging and forever. When she finished, he said, "I would like to give you something. For our anniversary. You do not need to give me anything, I know, but I want to." He led her out of the stable and across the yard to the east pasture, the one where her garden had flourished. "I have been thinking about what you said when we first married, about how you wanted to see the ocean. We cannot go there, not with 2 small children and a ranch to run, but I thought maybe we could bring a little bit of it here." He showed her the plans he had been working on with Pete. A pond, fed by a spring they had discovered on the property. Not an ocean, but water, a place of peace and beauty. Grace looked at the plans and then at him, tears shining in her eyes. "You remembered." "I remember everything you have ever told me," Mason said softly. "Every dream, every fear, every hope. You are my whole heart, Grace. Of course I remember." She kissed him then, there in the morning light, and Mason thought about how far they had both come. From loneliness to love, from strangers to soulmates, from surviving to thriving. The pond was completed by summer, a beautiful clear pool surrounded by cottonwood trees that Grace planted. She would take the children there in the afternoons, and their laughter would echo across the water. Sometimes Mason would join them, and they would sit by the shore while Grace sang and Samuel tried to catch frogs and Sarah made flower crowns from the wildflowers that grew nearby. As the years continued to pass, the ranch prospered beyond even Mason's ambitious dreams. They became one of the most successful operations in the territory, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. But more than that, they became known for something else. People would comment on how they could hear singing from the Zimmerman ranch at all hours, how Grace's voice seemed to bless the land itself. When Samuel was 7 and Sarah was 4, Grace gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named James and Thomas. The house, which they had expanded twice already, rang with noise and laughter and, yes, always with singing. Pete, now quite elderly, still lived in the bunkhouse and helped where he could. He would tell anyone who would listen about how he had known from the first that Mason and Grace were meant to be, conveniently forgetting that he had called them crazy when they first married. On a warm evening in 1889, 10 years after that fateful day when Mason first heard Grace singing, the whole family gathered on the porch. Mason and Grace sat in the rocking chairs they had bought for their 10th anniversary, watching as Samuel helped his younger siblings catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. "You remember what you asked me that first night," Grace said softly. Mason smiled. "I asked if you would sing to me too." "And I have been singing to you ever since," Grace said. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Mason reached over and took her hand, their wedding rings gleaming in the lamplight. "Never. I could listen to you sing every day for the rest of my life and never get tired of it." "Good," Grace said. "Because I do not plan to stop." As if to prove her point, she began to sing, a new song this time, one she had been working on. It was about a cowboy who found a woman singing to his horses, about how he asked if she would sing to him too, about how that simple question changed both their lives forever. The children stopped their playing to listen, as they always did when their mother sang. Samuel came and leaned against his father's chair. Sarah climbed into Grace's lap despite being too big for it. The twins sat on the porch steps, their young faces serious as they listened. And Mason, sitting there surrounded by the family they had built together, the life they had created from nothing but hope and hard work and love, felt a peace so profound it almost hurt. This was what his father had been searching for all those years. Not wealth or success, or even the satisfaction of taming wild land. This, family, love, home. Grace's song ended and the children erupted into applause. She laughed and shooed them back to their games, but Sarah refused to move from her lap. "Mama," she said seriously, "when I grow up, I want to sing just like you." "Then you shall, sweetheart," Grace said, kissing her daughter's head. "I will teach you everything I know." "And I want to run the ranch like Papa," Samuel added. "The ranch will be yours someday, son," Mason said. "Yours and your brothers and your sisters. It will belong to all of you." "But it will always belong to you and Mama first," Samuel said with the wisdom of a child who understood more than he should, "because you built it together." Grace and Mason exchanged a look over the children's heads, one of those wordless communications that came from years of marriage and deep understanding. "That is right," Mason said. "We built it together, and that is how you will keep it strong, together." As night fell completely and the children began to yawn, Grace herded them inside for bed. Mason stayed on the porch a while longer, looking out over the land that had tested him and shaped him, and ultimately rewarded him beyond his wildest dreams. He heard Grace singing inside, putting the children to bed with a lullaby. Her voice drifted out through the open windows, as much a part of this place now as the wind and the earth and the sky. When she finally came back outside and settled into the chair beside him, Mason said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For singing to my horses that day, for staying when I asked, for marrying me, for loving me, for building this life with me, for everything." Grace reached over and took his hand. "I should be thanking you. You gave me freedom and safety and a home. You gave me a family. You gave me love." "We gave those things to each other," Mason corrected gently. "Yes," Grace agreed. "I suppose we did." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Somewhere in the stable, one of the horses nickered softly. An owl called from the cottonwoods by the pond. The wind carried the scent of Grace's garden, rich with late summer growth. "Sing to me," Mason asked, as he would ask 1,000 more times over the years to come. And Grace did, her voice rising up into the New Mexico night, a song of love and home and happily ever after. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The children grew tall and strong, learning the ways of the ranch and the land. Samuel proved to have his father's head for business and his mother's compassionate heart. Sarah inherited her mother's voice and her father's determination. The twins, inseparable as only twins could be, became the ranch's best riders before they were even in their teens. Mason's hair began to gray at the temples, and Grace found laugh lines forming around her eyes. But they still worked side by side every day, still sat together on the porch every evening, and Grace still sang, her voice as beautiful at 40 as it had been at 22. In 1895, Samuel married a smart young woman named Elizabeth, who he had met in town. She fit into the family as easily as if she had always been there, and Grace welcomed her with open arms. 2 years later, Sarah became engaged to a rancher's son from the next county over, a good man who promised to always encourage her singing. The ranch continued to thrive, now employing over a dozen hands and running hundreds of head of cattle. But despite the growth and the success, Mason and Grace never forgot where they started. They kept the old stable, though it was no longer in use, because that was where their story had begun. They made sure to hire people who needed a second chance, remembering that Grace herself had once been running from a past she could not control. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason had a surprise for Grace. He had commissioned a music box, a beautiful thing crafted by a skilled artisan in Santa Fe. When you opened it, it played the melody of the first song she had ever sung to him, the one he had heard drifting through the evening air that September day so long ago. Grace cried when she opened it and Mason held her close. "How did you remember the tune?" she asked through her tears. "I could never forget it," Mason said simply. "It is the sound of my life changing for the better." That night, after the family celebration had ended and the grandchildren, Samuel and Elizabeth now had 2 young children of their own, had been put to bed, Mason and Grace took a walk out to the pond. The moon was full, painting everything in silver light. They sat on the bench Mason had built there years ago, and Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. 20 years, she said softly. It seems impossible. I know, Mason agreed. I feel like I just saw you in that stable yesterday. But then I look at our children, our grandchildren, everything we have built, and I realize just how much time has passed. Do you ever regret it? Grace asked. Marrying me so quickly, tying your life to mine before you really knew me. Mason turned to look at her, this woman who had been his partner and his love for 2 decades. Not for one single second. You are the best decision I ever made, Grace. The only decision that really mattered. I feel the same way, Grace said. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been if I had not stopped to sing to your horses that day, if I had just kept moving west, if I had never met you. But you did meet me, Mason said, and I met you, and here we are. Here we are, Grace echoed. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Then Grace began to sing, not one of her usual songs, but something new, something she composed on the spot about 20 years of love and life together. Mason listened, his eyes closed, and let the music wash over him. This was his favorite thing in all the world, sitting beside his wife while she sang. It always had been and always would be. As the years moved into the new century, Mason and Grace grew older but never old, if such a thing was possible. They still worked when they could, though the children and the hired hands did most of the heavy labor now. They spent their days tending Grace's garden, which had grown into something spectacular, and their evenings surrounded by family. More grandchildren came, filling the house with noise and laughter. Mason and Grace became the heart of not just their family but the whole community, known for their generosity and their enduring love for each other. When Samuel took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, Mason found he did not mind stepping back. He had built something that would last, something that would provide for generations to come. That was enough. On a warm September evening in 1905, 26 years after they first met, Mason and Grace sat on their porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in those deep purples Grace had always loved. Their children and grandchildren had all gone home after Sunday dinner, leaving the two of them alone in the comfortable quiet. You remember, Grace said suddenly, how terrified I was that first night, sleeping in the same bed as a man I barely knew. Mason chuckled. I was pretty terrified too, if I am being honest. Were you really? Of course. I had just married a beautiful woman in a hasty ceremony to save her from a bad situation. I had no idea if you would hate me in the morning or if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. It was not a mistake, Grace said softly. No, Mason agreed. It was the opposite of a mistake. It was the rightest thing I have ever done. Grace stood and held out her hand. Dance with me. There was no music, but that had never stopped them before. Mason took her hand and pulled her close, and they swayed together in the twilight, moving to a rhythm only they could hear. After a moment, Grace began to sing, soft and low, and Mason held her closer. This was everything. This moment, this woman, this life they had built together. Everything else was just details. When the song ended, Grace pulled back slightly to look up at him. I love you, Mason Zimmerman. I have loved you for 26 years, and I will love you for however many more years we are given. I love you too, Mason said. More than I could ever put into words. As they stood there in the gathering darkness, Mason thought about that young man who had ridden up to his ranch 26 years ago, tired and lonely and barely holding on. He wished he could go back and tell that young man that everything was going to be all right, that he would find love in the most unexpected way, that his life was about to change in the best possible way. But then again, maybe that young man would not have believed it anyway. Some things you just had to live through to understand. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that were part of every long life. Pete passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1907, at the age of 82. The whole family mourned him, but Grace sang at his funeral, a beautiful tribute to the man who had given her a chance when she needed it most. One by one, the children married and had children of their own. The ranch house, expanded again and again, became a gathering place for the extended family. Sunday dinners were loud, chaotic affairs with sometimes 20 or more people around the table. Through it all, Mason and Grace remained the steady center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They still sat on the porch every evening, still held hands, still looked at each other with the same love that had grown from those hasty vows spoken in a small church so many years before. In the spring of 1910, as Mason approached his 58th birthday and Grace her 54, they took a trip, their first real journey away from the ranch in years. The children insisted on it, saying they deserved a rest and an adventure. Mason took Grace to California, to the ocean she had always wanted to see. They stood on the beach in San Francisco, watching the waves crash against the shore, and Grace cried tears of joy. "It is even more beautiful than I imagined," she said. "Thank you for bringing me here," Grace said that evening as they sat in their hotel room overlooking the water. "Thank you for waiting so patiently for me to bring you," Mason replied. "It was worth the wait," Grace said. "Everything with you has always been worth the wait." They spent a week by the ocean, walking on the beach, collecting shells, watching the sunset over the water. On their last evening there, as they sat on the sand and watched the sky turn from blue to purple to black, Grace sang. Her voice carried over the sound of the waves, and people walking nearby stopped to listen. When she finished, several people applauded. Grace blushed and ducked her head, and Mason squeezed her hand. "You still get shy when people praise your singing," he observed. "I only ever sing for you," Grace said. "Everyone else just happens to overhear." They returned to the ranch refreshed and happy, with stories to tell and memories to treasure. Life settled back into its familiar rhythms. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management. More great-grandchildren were born. The family grew and thrived. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the whole family threw them a party that was talked about for years after. People came from all over the territory, now the state of New Mexico, since statehood had been granted the year before. There was dancing and food and music, and Grace sang, her voice as pure and clear as ever. Mason watched her, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt such profound gratitude it almost overwhelmed him. 30 years. 3 decades of love and partnership and building something meaningful together. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Grace came and sat beside Mason, both of them tired but happy. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am," Mason said. "How lucky we both are." "It is not luck," Grace said. "It is work. Hard work every single day to keep choosing each other and choosing love." "You are right," Mason agreed, "but I am still lucky that I get to do that work with you." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "Ask me." "Ask you what?" "What you asked me the first night. What you have asked me 1,000 times since." Mason smiled. "Will you sing to me?" And Grace did, there on the porch where they had spent so many evenings over so many years. She sang about a cowboy and a woman and horses and love and a life built together. She sang about home and family and forever. As her voice rose into the New Mexico night, Mason closed his eyes and let himself drift on the music. This was peace. This was contentment. This was love. The years grew shorter as they aged, or perhaps it just seemed that way. Birthdays came and went. The family continued to grow. Mason and Grace grew grayer and moved a little slower, but the love between them never dimmed. On an evening in late September 1920, 41 years after they first met, Mason sat on the porch and watched the sunset. Grace was inside, preparing dinner with help from their granddaughter. He could hear her singing through the open window, her voice perhaps not as strong as it once was but still beautiful, still capable of making his heart ache with love. He thought about all the years, all the moments, all the joys and sorrows they had shared. Their first kiss in that tiny church. The births of their children, the loss of friends and loved ones, the building of the ranch, the laughter of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Every single moment had led to this one, sitting on this porch, listening to his wife sing. Grace came out a few minutes later and settled into the chair beside him. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said. "Good," Mason said. "I am hungry." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from blue to purple. Finally, Grace said, "Do you remember the first time you asked me to sing to you?" "Of course," Mason said. "I will never forget it. I had just found you in my stable, singing to my horses, and I asked if you would sing to me too." "And I said yes," Grace said softly. "I have been saying yes to you ever since. And I have been grateful for every single yes," Mason replied. Grace reached over and took his hand. Their fingers, gnarled now with age but still strong, intertwined as they had so many thousands of times before. "Sing to me," Mason asked, as he always did. Grace smiled and began to sing, the same song she had sung that very first time, the one the music box played, the one that was etched into both their hearts. Mason listened and felt tears prick his eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming emotion of a life well lived and a love well kept. When the song ended, they sat together as the stars emerged overhead, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. They did not need words. They had said everything that needed saying over 4 decades of love and partnership. Now they just needed to be together, here in this moment, savoring the peace and contentment of a love that had lasted a lifetime. Mason Zimmerman lived to be 76 years old, Grace to 72. They were blessed with 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren by the time they passed. First Grace in the winter of 1926, and then Mason following her just 3 months later, as if he could not bear to be in a world without her voice. But that ending was still years away on that September evening in 1920. For now, they sat together on the porch of the home they had built, surrounded by the life they had created, listening to the sounds of family and ranch and home. "I love you," Grace said softly. "I love you too," Mason replied. "Always." And somewhere in the stable, the horses whinnied softly, as if they too remembered that September evening 41 years before when a lonely cowboy had heard a beautiful woman singing and had asked if she would sing to him too. As if they understood that, from that simple question had grown a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of taking chances and opening your heart and choosing love even when, especially when, it seemed impossible. Grace Zimmerman began to sing once more, her voice carrying across the ranch that she and Mason had built together, across the land that had tested them and shaped them and ultimately blessed them. The song spoke of love found and kept, of family and home, of a life lived fully and without regret. And Mason listened, as he had listened 1,000 times before and would listen 1,000 times more, and knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly who he was meant to be with, living exactly the life he was meant to live. The end.